Good morning. This is Grace Pan from Zuber Lawler. Welcome to webinar this morning, how to communicate with FDA. I'm your moderator for this panel. And with me is the host from ProClinical, Miss Claire Perry. Claire, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Grace. Hi, as Grace said, my name is Claire. I'm Vice President at ProClinical Executive Search. We're a boutique executive search firm, part of a larger staffing brand. I'd very much like to introduce our moderator and panelists now. We're very lucky to be joined by Grace Pan. Grace is a partner at Zuber Lawler. She focuses on patent litigation, IPRs, deals, and portfolio management, and all other intellectual property litigation and deals. She also has experience with freedom to operate, non-infringement, and invalidity opinions. Grace has represented clients in respect to a wide range of technologies, including as it relates to semiconductor equipment manufacturing, surveillance cameras, optical discs, Wi-Fi, bit for placement, information indexing to facilitate search engines, and electronic commerce. Grace is fluent in both Mandarin Chinese, Japanese, and is adamant as a foreign attorney in both China and Japan. In addition to her experience litigating before various US district courts and the Court of Appeals for the federal circuits, she has also litigated before the Tokyo District Court, the Tokyo IP High Court, the Taipei District Court, and the Beijing District People's Court. I would now like to introduce our panelists. We have Marc Sanchez. Marc is the founder of Contract In-House Counsel and Consultants, LLC. Marc is highly experienced in matters involving the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act related laws. Marc provides counseling on pre-market strategies, including product development, clinical investigations, orphan drug and other designations, pre-market applications, controlled correspondence, dispute resolution and appeals, monograph reviews, GRAS petitions, and marketing and classification review for human and animal products. On post-marketing strategies, Marc provides counseling on labeling, advertising and promotion, product recalls, good manufacturing practices, and responding to agency enforcement actions. He works with the USDA, where he handles matters encompassing drugs, biologics, and medical foods. Marc is especially well-versed in food and drug enforcement actions. I'd like to now introduce Karen Richards. Karen is the Senior Vice President of In Vitro Diagnostics and Quality for Precision Medicine. Karen provides regulatory and quality consulting services to the IVD industry. Karen works in the IVD industry for her whole 30-year career and has worked many of these years inside IVD companies, both within companies and as a consultant for the past 5 years. Karen has had numerous opportunities to engage and interact with the FDA. She finds these interactions to be an important part of any regulatory strategy, particularly proactive discussions and use of FDA's formal and informal communication options. Karen looks forward to engaging with the panel and audience on this topic. And last but not least, we're joined by Mckean. Mac is a Fellow of Regulatory Science at Boston Scientific. Mac has over 30 years experience in the medical device industry in various leadership roles supporting product development and FDA regulatory approval of Class 3 implantable products. Mac has been an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota for the last 13 years, teaching both undergraduate and graduate level courses on the total product lifecycle process and journey to FDA approval and commercialization of cardiac devices. Mac is currently a fellow at Boston Scientific in the Interventional Cardiology Division, supporting new and novel regulatory strategies and programs related to the global ethylene oxide sterilization network. Marc is RAC certified and recognized as a fellow by the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, also known as FRAPS. And Marc is based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and enjoys family life with his children and grandchildren, all 10 of them. Thank you. I'll hand it back to you now, Grace.
Thank you, Claire. So we'll start our panel discussion. So Mac, we'll start with you because you have a lot of experience in marketing and so on and so forth. So if a company is under a warning letter or other compliance issue, how does that affect the communication and relationship with FDA? How would you handle that situation? You are on mute, sorry.
Okay, well, that was staged on purpose, right? Because it wouldn't be a meeting if somebody said, in fact, I heard that's the code of 2020. You're on mute. So now we've checked that box.
Yes.
So we might as well start out kind of with the heavy issue, right? The sort of the elephant in the room. But yeah, yes. To get to the point of a warning letter, I'm not saying that you at some point have failed in your communication strategy with FDA.
Sure.
It's not so much that as it is just really compliance with the regulation and the volatility of your product. So just kind of a quick overview I know we've got a range of folks on attending from new to the profession, old folks like myself, but FDA has 3 compliance statuses in their secret database, so to speak, right? NAI, VAI, OAI, right? So no action indicated, voluntary action indicated, and official action indicated. So you have an OAI status if you're at a warning letter, right? So clearly you've got an issue. And one of the enforcement tools that FDA employs is they'll put your PMA review, if you have a PMA under review with the agency, they'll put that on hold. So now they have senior management's attention. Not that senior management has to insert themselves in the communication process, but it's a very formal engagement at this point. So also worth noting is to sort of avoid getting to the OAI or even the warning letter is you're going to have sort of a warning to the warning, right? You're going to have had an inspection, maybe it didn't go as well as you hoped. There's some 43 issues that have been noted about your quality system compliance or the volatility of your product or process. And you have a chance to respond formally to FDA within 15 days. While not required, it's certainly encouraged. And so what FDA, the practice they're doing now, and I actually sort of see this as helping the transparency in the process, is they'll indicate in the warning letter whether you've adequately addressed the 483 noncompliance issue. So the point here on the communication is that take those 483s seriously, not that you wouldn't, and make sure that you've adequately addressed that nonconformity, both in the issue found for FDA, but also systemically. FDA is really looking, it's almost from a CAPA standpoint, you want to look across your quality system and in your enterprise and business to make sure you fix this everywhere it occurs. And a special note, particularly small firms, small and medium-sized firms, use consultants, outside consultants. This isn't a plug here, but get another perspective on that response to ensure that it's adequate. And because if you can get in front of that 483 in that response, you can avoid the warning letter. But if, of course, you get to the warning letter, you have to really practice professional, data-driven, high engagement, high credibility communications with whoever you're working with at FDA. And just one final note, clearly as FDA returns to conducting inspections, they haven't really conducted any inspections for the last 18 months, but post-pandemic, you can anticipate an increase in enforcement activities and warning letters. So again, the communication now is critical to avoid that.
Thank you, Mac. So now we're talking about communication with the FDA. So what are the formal ways you can interact with FDA through pre-submission process? Karen, maybe you can elaborate on that.
Sure, thanks Grace, and thanks for the opportunity to participate today. So the pre-submission process is really an excellent way to have early interactions with FDA. And whether you're introducing yourself to them for the first time through informational meetings, or asking for a study risk determination, or requesting feedback on analytical and clinical study designs, it's a free and informative process for both parties. And FDA has published a guidance document on the pre-sub process, and it's more formally called the Q submission program. And they updated that as recently as January of this year. It's a really useful guide to help identify what types of meetings FDA will accommodate and the content that they're looking for and timeframes for which you should expect a response. So just as an example, for a pre-submission meeting, which is typically a meeting where you're seeking some feedback on various, in the case of in vitro diagnostics, various analytical and clinical studies that you're planning to perform, your strategy for how you plan to submit a future application, et cetera. If you do that submission, FDA will provide you with written feedback within 70 days. If you want to have a meeting, whether it's a teleconference or an in-person meeting, they strive to have that within 60 to 75 days of your original submission. And typically that written feedback comes before, about 5 days before any in-person or teleconference. So one thing that's important is, in addition to the content of your pre-submission, is that you identify some options to the agency for meeting dates and times within the pre-submission, just to give them a window for when your folks that you're going to have attend may be available. Another area for study risk determination, so different than pre-submission where you can actually have a meeting, for a study risk determination type pre-sub where companies are asking FDA to determine whether a clinical study is non-significant risk or significant risk, FDA will provide a formal letter within 90 days. So that's a more formal response, but it doesn't mean that you can't ask questions once you get the letter back if you don't understand or don't agree or have questions about that formal designation. And just a note around COVID is that the pre-submission process has been less accessible to companies, with FDA limiting the process for use with potential COVID-related 510Ks or for feedback on non-COVID related topics such as companion diagnostic strategies or breakthrough technologies. But we still encourage companies to understand and engage with FDA through this process as it's available, because it's extremely informative and a unique opportunity for FDA and companies to engage with each other and come to some understanding about what your plans are.
I see. Thank you, Karen. In this pre-submission to the FDA, is this a one-shot deal, or can you actually make changes to it? I'm just wondering, like, you know, how, like if you, is there some types of guideline you can use? And, you know, like, will you have an opportunity to correct? Would FDA give you a chance, or can you call them and discuss with them before you put in the submission? So to make sure you have, you know, a better chance of succeeding?
So any of all that's possible. So the pre-sub is a, you know, there's a, as I mentioned, there's a guidance for that. If you're using it to get feedback on, for example, the analytical clinical design, you're certainly able to contact the division director if you have a question, but more importantly, you know, you put your best effort into the pre-submission, but oftentimes as FDA is reviewing the content of the pre-submission, they may have questions about the content, and an interaction can start during that initial review, even before you've had the meeting. Also, as an outcome of the meeting, there will be minutes that are published, and there can also be supplements to the pre-sub if during the pre-sub process, FDA asks you for additional information, or you agree to table something for a subsequent submission. So it can be an ongoing and interactive process with the agency.
I see. And what kind of supporting data in what format does one submit when requesting a pre-sub meeting?
So for in vitro diagnostics, because that's the area that I focus in, but FDA doesn't specifically want to review a lot of data or render decisions on data. It's not that they won't look at it, but it's not really intended to be an opportunity to preview your future 510K or PMA data set. However, you do include a detailed device description of your product and what area, what code you think it aligns with, what regulation, or if you're pursuing de novo, why you think it's unique. But then what's really important, and we do pretty regularly with the agency, is we provide, for the analytical and clinical studies, we provide the agency with a purpose, the study design, the number of replicas, the number of instruments, number of sites, acceptance criteria, et cetera, that we are using for each study, and if we're following the CLSI document or not, and why. So it's a detailed review for the agency to know how you're going to analytically and clinically validate the device, and for which you're seeking their feedback. So it's less about data that you've already generated and less that data is instrumental to why you're approaching your analytical and clinical study designs the way you are in the pre-sub.
I see. Thank you, Karen.
Sure.
Marc, do you have would you like to add something to Karen's answer?
Yeah, just to comment on, you mentioned, Grace, the ability to kind of change the pre-submission once you have it in.
Yes.
And I think the communication, either in a pre-submission, in the pre-market context, or in the enforcement context that Mac was referencing, where in enforcement, the stakes are a little higher because you have that brand damage and you have the recall and so forth, if it's a labeling issue or a manufacturing issue.
Yes.
I think the key is to have command and control. You want to show
Yes.
competency to the agency.
Yes.
So when you do a pre-submission to the agency, you should really have it not perfect, but as good as it can be going in the first time.
Yes.
You don't want to do an oops-a-daisy kind of approach to say, well, use this file instead, or use this file instead. I mean, sometimes you do need a supplement for a reason.
Yes.
So for example, I'm working with a client that does not want to do any biocompatibility on animals. And it's pretty unique to not use animals in biocompatibility. So it has been a lot of back and forth. Well, what about rib testing, human rib testing? What about this new model that hasn't been validated? And that kind of back and forth as we look for different models of non-animal based biocompatibility is not showing incompetence. It's just kind of exploring something that's very new, both for the client and for FDA, versus kind of a situation where you feel like you want to ask a question you forgot, or you want to add material you forgot, you're changing your product code. So I think if it's in a pre-market context or a post-market context, just having that real confidence in the communication and that real clarity, so you really show the FDA that you're in control of the situation and know the regulations well.
Got it. Thank you, Marc. So now we're talking about communicating with FDA, and you want to make sure you're submitting something as accurate as possible. I'm going to go back to Mac. So how do you be as credible as you can with the FDA? What would be your recommendation, Mac?
Okay, get off mute again. Yeah, it's something, it's not that we need another acronym, but as regulatory professionals, we're storytellers in a very important way for the firm, right? The millions of dollars and years of testing, development, clinical study, all come through your quality system in the form of documentation and evidence, right? So as part of the art form that I call regulatory science, it's important that the submission be prepared to fulfill what I call the 4 C's, right? First, be clear. No errors or formatting or typos, right? It kind of goes back to Marc's comment about being credible, right? Don't waste FDA's time trying to find something. These need to be well-organized submissions. And likewise, be concise. Effectively organize complex information and data sets in tables and graphs, and your narrative, most importantly, because that's the story, that translates those tens of thousands of pages of data and reports into the submission story and body. And don't lose anything in translation, right? Don't exclude the failures and things of that nature, right? Put it all there, just do it nice and concise. And be compelling. That's the 3rd C, right? Let the data do the talking and showcase how all the applicable standards, requirements, and regulations for your product and your process have been met. And be sure to include human factors, whether it's animal testing, as Marc said, or just usability. And maybe that comes out in your clinical trial. And even more so as we advance this process with FDA, real world applications and real world evidence, if that's available in the pre-market stage of your submission. Okay, and then finally, be complete. The goal in your regulatory submission, right, is to answer all the questions that FDA may ask. So basically, get on offense. So, including all necessary and required information to complete the review, and make sure certainly get through the refuse to accept process, whether it's a PMA or a 510K. Those guidance documents are out there. So those are more around sort of gaping holes in your submission. But again, those are the 4 C's. Tell the story, make the translation of highly complex data sets, lose nothing in transmission or translation, and be truthful and credible.
Thank you, Mac. Karen, do you have additional comments to add to Mac's answer?
No, I mean, I just think that, and this is part of, maybe a further question in the webinar here, but I do think that, being credible with the agency is really important. Acknowledge your mistakes, acknowledge your data. If your data is good, your data is bad. You want to be transparent with them. And I think the credibility is really around the quality of the submission. And that's why I was encouraging, really being clear about the content of your, in this case, in the example I was giving with the pre-sub, that you provide a quality submission and do your homework before you send that in.
Thank you, Karen. What about conversations? Like we're talking about written submissions. What kind of conversations can people have with the FDA? What's allowed? Obviously, we cannot just call up FDA and just have any type of conversation. So probably how do people go about communicating, which is the main focus of this webinar. So maybe you can shed some light and explain to everybody how one can initiate a conversation with the FDA.
Yeah, so we kind of have formal ways of interacting and informal ways of interacting with FDA. One of the formal ways we talked about using the pre-submission process. Just you have a way of engaging with them in multiple ways. One is that you just get written feedback. One is that you can have a in-person meeting or have a teleconference with the agency. And these are all formal parts of the process. One of the benefits of the formal interaction is the opportunity to hear from specific individuals at the agency and better understand where they're coming from. Because in the written feedback, you don't know which participant wrote a response to your questions in the pre-sub. But when you participate in an in-person meeting or teleconference, you have the benefit of saying, oh, okay, that was coming from the medical director, or that was coming from the statistician. And you have that opportunity to better understand who is part of the conversation so that you can then have more informal follow-up. We have many examples where we've had a formal pre-submission meeting. You have the opportunity to meet your reviewer, and then you can engage with them in a conversation by reaching out to them. And sometimes those conversations, those informal conversations, are obviously off the record. Mm-hmm. Because they're not part of the minutes of the pre-sub, they're not part of the formal written engagement or the follow-on. But it is an opportunity to continue a dialogue with the agency, and that can be achieved most successfully through calls, because FDA doesn't want to necessarily have something in an email or that's outside of the formal communication process. But certainly picking up the phone and having a conversation with the agency in an informal way is a benefit to having set up a formal meeting in the first place, because you get to know each other. And it can give you additional insights into what FDA is thinking.
Thank you, Karen. Are these calls discretionary by the agency, or these because, I mean, these conversations by rights, every applicant is, they're entitled to have.
Well, FDA can decide whether they're comfortable engaging you in a off meeting conversation, but that's where the development of the relationship's important. And whether you're working within a company or you're working as a consultant to many companies, regulatory professionals establish relationships with different division reviewers. And even though the parties change, oftentimes over subsequent years, you'll find that somebody that was not necessarily a lead reviewer during your 2008 meeting, but they were a deputy or someone sitting in at the time, and now they're the lead of the division. So just establishing the rapport and the relationships between FDA and the manufacturer is really important. And somebody has written into the chat about how binding are the written answers in the pre-sub, and unfortunately they're non-binding unless FDA wants to use them as binding. So, we've had positive and negative experiences with pre-subs, but in terms of how binding they are, it's very difficult to go back to FDA and say, hey, you said in the pre-sub that we could do X, Y, Z, because one of the things that we never know as individuals is all of the activities that have happened behind the scenes between the time we did a pre-sub and the time we did our submission. And FDA sees way more products and way more submissions and issues than we see. So you can't really go back to them and say, you said we could do it this way in this meeting. But it doesn't prevent the agency from coming back and saying, we advised you to do it this way in this meeting and you have not submitted it that way. So it can be a bit of a two-edged sword, but I do still strongly recommend that it is a process that can be really useful and successful for companies to engage with the agency. And there's no cost associated with it.
Thank you, Karen. This is actually to all the panelists. Somebody actually is asking a question. If there's a way, people can find out who's going to be on the panel before the pre-submission meeting. For litigation, we usually do know, who your judges are, except for oral argument before the CAFC. Then you find out the day of when you walk in. How does that work, with FDA? Like you were saying earlier, like the written.
I can address that, Grace. So for one thing, we start bugging the agency a couple of weeks before the action date to say, hey, so the meeting's coming up. Can you tell us who you anticipate, who you've invited, who you anticipate attending the meeting? And oftentimes FDA, one of the rules of thumb that we used to joke about is that FDA always wants to know how many people you're bringing so that they can bring 5 more. But I think what's really important is the minute you do the pre-sub and you're assigned a reviewer, you have somebody to talk to. And that's the person you could reach out to a couple of weeks before the meeting and say, hey, who have you invited? Who do you anticipate participating? Sometimes they don't know yet, but we'll keep pushing for that because it is important to know who your key players. It doesn't mean you get a list of everybody until the day of the meeting, but you'll know in advance by asking, which division director or which statistician or which medical officer may be attending the meeting. And that's very helpful because then you can either research that person or find out, does anybody else have experience interacting with that individual? What are their push points? So you can definitely informally reach out to the person assigned to the pre-sub and ask them those questions.
I see. Thank you. And the panelists will stay the same, right, until this case is completed?
No, not necessarily, because people get promoted and moved around and change jobs, and no, you don't necessarily have that continuity. just by the nature of FDA being a body that changes reviewers. There's
one of Jeff Shuren's chief complaints is industry keeps hiring away FDA staff, right?
That is exactly true.
So we're kind of creating the problem ourselves.
Yes, we are. But they do attempt to have, if there's certainly between, the time you identify the meeting date and the meeting, they try to make sure there's continuity, but it doesn't mean that that person's going to be around. And that can be its own challenge. The time between a pre-sub and the time of a submission can be a year, it can be 3 years. And there's no guarantee that the people that reviewed the pre-submission and provided the feedback are going to still be there. This is my kitty cat who loves Zoom meetings. So let me just try to get her out of the way here.
Now it's complete.
That's right. That's
That's great. Mark, would you like to add some comments to Karen and Mac's comments?
Yeah, to the point about communicating with the FDA,
Yes.
I think there's two things there. One, no matter if it's informal or formal, I think one of the pet peeves of the FDA in any center, tobacco, drug device, is not to use them as your consultant. So how you phrase the question or how you interact, they don't want to be your outsourced consultant. If you need someone to consult with regulations, there are people to hire, and they get very frustrated with that kind of aspect of it. And I think in terms of informal communication, there's a good and a bad to it. The good is you can informally build these relationships and kind of learn to navigate the agency. Because sometimes you can run into a complex situation like with imports where you have Lawler, the Office of Regulatory Affairs, the subject matter expert like CDRH, and maybe a local district office, and trying to figure out who to communicate with that situation. And it can be hard to know who's the lead in the hierarchy. So that informal relationship can help you navigate who's the best office to contact with your particular issue. The challenge, I will say, is if it's on a substantive issue like a biocompatibility question or a clinical data question, it's better to do that through a formal process, either through a pre-sub or through an email. Because even though it can be a challenge, at least you're putting it into the administrative record. And if it's in the administrative record, it's not a guarantee that you're going to win on a 1075 appeal, but it can at least be there as an argument to say, hey, we had a reviewer on this day say, if you do the study this way, it would be acceptable protocol. And then you do that protocol and they turn around and reject it. You can have a basis for an argument, whereas you do the informal communication on the phone, you're kind of stuck because it's not in the administrative record. So informal is really helpful to navigate sometimes, but you just have to be careful when you use that informal communication.
I see. Thank you, Mark. So, does everybody know, that last 15 months or so has been a big challenge for everybody in the world with this pandemic and COVID. And so, we're wondering how does FDA handle surprises and new developments and, this digital age and AI? Maybe we can start with Mac. What are your thoughts since, Boston Scientific is always coming up.
What versus the digital health, Mark, you want to respond to that? I guess kind of the pandemic and the challenge.
Yeah, so with COVID, there's been an obvious move. Everyone's moved to Zoom, so pre-submission and things have moved to Zoom. There's also been some adaptation for FDA to deal with things like telemedicine. Some of the in vitro diagnostics that were supposed to only be used by physicians or in clinical settings have had to be adjusted to say, how do we do a COVID test in a drive-through or through a pharmacy? Or how do we allow telemedicine to be more accessible? So FDA has used both the emergency use authorization pathways to address some of these issues. They've listened to some feedback through the process of doctors and other experts trying to get access to medicine to their patients. So it's been slow. I mean, the agency is always slow to change, but these informal communications, as well as formal pathways like EUAs, have kind of helped the agency adapt in the pandemic to say there are ways that we can readjust. I think the big question now is, as the pandemic hopefully begins to wind down at the end of the year and we lift the emergency use that the HHS has and those EUAs go away, how new rulemaking or new guidance comes out to make some of those changes part of the regular regulations that we deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, thanks, Mark. Just last week, FDA had a big regulatory educational program. They do it once a year. If you missed it, I recommend you keep an eye out for it next year. But they had disclosed in there that they got over 7,000 EUA applications, 7,000 in the last, well, since the beginning of the pandemic. And all the while, right, the documentation control center is open. They received over 25,000 regulatory submissions, right? Because industry moves on, right? So just a huge crush of work and priorities on the agency. So really just recognize my personal belief and perception is FDA has done a remarkable job, particularly CDRH, and there's IVD and drugs as well, to maintain their process while managing and dealing with the pandemic. So, one thing to consider to build on is, be mindful that when you communicate with FDA and you engage them either with a pre-submission and pretty much, I think as was mentioned earlier, all the slots are taken up probably through the end of this calendar year, right? They'll work on exception basis, but if you ask for a routine pre-submission meeting, you're probably out in January, February. But the point is, be very concise with your communication and respectful of FDA's time, just because they're under such a workload crush. And even Dr. Shuren said that, we're into next year before they really kind of get through this backlog. But all the while, they've been mindful of their MDUFA commitments and meeting those target review and decision dates. So again, I just think FDA has really done a remarkable job during this pandemic.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mac. Karen, what do you think about how FDA is handling these teleconferences?
Well, I think that for one thing, they don't like to be on camera. So they use the WebEx platform, but they don't want to, at least with the IVD folks that I work with, they don't want to be on camera. But, the question about how to handle teleconferences, I think is important, because we often get questions from clients as whether to have an in-person meeting versus a teleconference with FDA. And, setting COVID aside for a moment, there's certainly pros and cons to both. In-person meetings give companies a chance to meet their reviewers, look in their eyes, watch for body language, et cetera. Whereas teleconferences don't really have that kind of nonverbal observation that you can make. But one of the key benefits of teleconference is that FDA can and will take the opportunity to put companies on hold or on mute when they want to have an internal discussion. The benefit of that is it can get to a decision very quickly, whereas when they're in the public one-on-one or public in-person setting, they have no opportunity to have that sidebar conversation because you're all right there. And so it can tend to leave some issues hanging that may have otherwise been available through letting them have an offline conversation and then come back to you. And similarly, companies can do that. Not that we're all in the same place, but there is an opportunity as well to, have a company say, hey, FDA, I need to consider that. Can we put you on mute for a minute? And you go and have that conversation and come back to them. So it can really be helpful. And, one thing to really keep in mind, though, on teleconferences, that whispers can be heard louder than voices. So you really want to coach your teams that are participating in these teleconferences on how and when to participate, because unless they're smart like Mac and they put their mute on when they're trying to speak, there are circumstances where if they're all in the same room and there's whispering going on, that actually that could be heard really, really well.
Well, I think to build on that point, Karen, it's important. Yeah. We do at least 2 dry runs, right? You go through it, you've got the sort of mock FDA devil's advocate, and everybody, and you actually have hand signals in the room, right? Because you're not on a video, but it's like this point.
Yeah.
And just while I've got the floor here, there's a question came in. How much weight does it hold to have an industry expert known to the FDA on your team going into a meeting with FDA? In other words, a KOL, right? A key opinion leader. That helps. But as long as they're sort of credible and been involved maybe in your usability, human factors, and certainly maybe a PI in your clinical trial, right? But you can also overweight that and bring in too much horsepower, right? And also, it's kind of hard to script these brilliant petitions, right?
Exactly.
So that's, if you bring in a KOL, you know, whether they're published or otherwise, be sure that you've got them on a script, and you know that there's certain points they want to make, because otherwise it's kind of like, and nothing against CEOs, right? But it's not a great strategy to bring your CEO to a pre-sub, because he'll talk about how great the fabulous the company and product is for 45 minutes and use up all your time to work through the questions. So, you know, they can listen in and they can welcome everyone, but then that's about it.
Yep.
Okay, so let's stay on the CDRH, which Mac mentioned earlier. What have they done recently in terms of product life cycle structure? Maybe can you elaborate a little bit on that? And how does that affect the communication with FDA?
Well, for those, well, not historians, but here, well, I guess about, well, pre-pandemic, about 2019, they've been talking about it for a while. FDA reorganized what was ODE, kind of the pre-market, Office of Device Evaluation, into what they call a super office, right? There's more air quotes in the video. And so they now have this Office of Product Evaluation and Quality, or OPEC, and it's really organized around functional product lines, which enables the FDA experts to apply their knowledge throughout that total product life cycle end to end, right? So this helps consolidate and integrate the product review and quality and surveillance and enforcement team to a team-based review approach. In other words, I think as Karen said earlier, FDA sees a lot of what we don't see, right? Whether it's in the public domain and many of these sort of compliance issues that are occurring in industry, only FDA has purview to. So if you start seeing questions about something, and then you can map that to a competitor recall, you're understanding why FDA has maybe pivoted from what they talked about in the pre-sub meeting, but there's new information there. So really about this reorganization, I think, you know, whether there's a metric around it, I mean, it's kind of part of MDUFA, but this super office, if you look at the org chart on the FDA website, they got a whole web page dedicated to it, really talks about that alignment. So I think anecdotally, it's helped the review process and make it more predictable, just like MDUFA initiatives do, is we want this process to be resourced and we want it to be predictable, right? We understand it's a data-driven process, and we're obligated as industry to provide that safety and effectiveness evidence to determine the product can be approved. But you know, just understand that broader view. So as you write your submissions, right, and you tell your story, you know, be aware of competitive product issues that may be occurring and get in front of it in terms of your submission and narrative. One example recently, and not to pick on Philips, big Philips, I was astounded by this, but they have a ventilator CPAP machine that's been on the market for years. And I don't know if it was 5 or 6 million products in scope of this class 1 recall, because it has what turned out to be a toxic insulation material that was breaking down and could be ingested by the user. And this is kind of a, you know, off the shelf for commercial product as well as a prescription product. And I don't think they saw that coming, but the total cost of this at the end of the day, they've already said it's 600 million plus US just to deal with the products, but there's market share, as Marc had mentioned about brand, damage to the brand, but I estimate that this will be a $1 billion hit to Philips. And because somebody in that pre-market stage didn't do their biocompatibility, perhaps, I'm conjecturing here, but this is a pretty big fail to let a toxic material get into a product, respirator product, and then let this thing go on for years and years. But so anyway, that's kind of an overview of the total product life cycle, is they have that broader view. So again, your strategy as a firm is to also present your submission in that broader view, and again, get on offense in terms of what would they ask potentially about maybe even post-market study requirements.
Thank you, Mac. Well, let's stay on that topic for a little while. What is the difference between communications in pre-market context and post-market context? Just, that's I think it's an important distinction. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more, especially using Philip's case on the CPAP, the sleep apnea device.
Well, I guess I'd like to hear from Marc on that. I put you on the spot because you're really a total product lifecycle from the practice that you have, right? So what are your thoughts?
I think there are three primary differences between pre-market and post-market. In the post-market, the stakes are a little bit higher. You have brand damage, you have the potential for recall, adverse event reporting. There's something could be wrong to seriously wrong in the issue, and the stakes are a little higher than another few months off market because you don't get your pre-market clearance. So in that sense, the stakes are a little higher. I think also one of the differences is there's a presumption of incompetence off the bat. If you have a really well-written pre-submission or really well-written 510K or de novo or GROS or whatever the application is, you can come across as very competent in control. When you're found with a post-market violation, there's this idea that you've done something wrong. Either it could be something big, like you're trying to be a cosmetic and you're really a drug. You think you're class 1, but you're really class 3. There can be some real big misunderstandings of the regulations that create this perception of incompetence you have to overcome. And I think the third point that's different for smaller to mid-sized firms, it can feel very personal. The FDA is saying you did something wrong, and the reaction can range from, I've seen clients kind of with labeling errors or issues kind of jump up and down, say my freedom of speech rights are being infringed. You kind of get a very angry response. You can kind of get this, I didn't know what I was doing response. So you can kind of start to take it personal in a way that's not professional. And if you don't intervene and have a consultant come in and say, don't communicate to FDA why these emotions are so fresh, which they are in an enforcement context, or have a consultant that can filter those emotions and say, okay, you vented to me, and let me filter that into something that's usable with the FDA. That communication can continue to damage that perception of incompetence because the FDA says, okay, you didn't understand the regulations in the first place. Now you're coming through with a really bad, unprofessional response. This is a bad actor, and we need to take official action more quickly than we would have thought when we first interacted. So I think those three differences are really unique to the post-market setting.
Thank you. Thank you, Marc. Karen, would you like to add to Marc's comments?
Well, I think that, I think he did a good job of covering really what you need to do in that setting. And yeah, I think we can just continue with the theme.
Okay. I have one more questions, and then we'll jump to questions. I'd like to ask each one of you to share with us what's the secret of your success with FDA, and we'll start with Karen.
Sure. So I think, secrets to success in communicating with FDA comes from really an understanding of where they're coming from. I know that companies often find interacting with FDA to be frustrating, but I always like to remind my management teams that the FDA is a group of people just like we are. They have a job to do. The approach to their job and the measures they take come from a different perspective, but they're still people doing a job. And, last year was a great example for, I got a letter from FDA that they could not review my client's application for a submission. And so I reached out to the reviewer to discuss the matter. And I started the conversation by saying, that we understand and appreciate the volume of applications they're looking at and the additional burdens brought on by COVID, and thanked her for that. And she actually cried on the phone and said that, she would share that appreciation with her colleagues because they don't hear that very much. And so fundamentally, you want to treat FDA respectfully, like Mac was pointing out, respectfully and like you would treat any other human being. And I think both Marc and Mac have said, secondly, be prepared. Do your homework, present your case, look at any previous decisions from FDA in the area that you're working in that may be relevant, and show them that you've considered what's been done before, even if your approach is new and unique. And just lastly, be willing to connect with them. Be willing to ask them questions. Don't be afraid to reach out. FDA always will tell you they're willing and able to help where they can.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Mark?
Yeah, I think I would echo the respect. If it's the CRH with COVID that's had an inundation of submissions because of the pandemic and the regular submissions, or you go to the Center for Tobacco that just had their first vape deadline and received applications for over 4 million products. And 4 million products coming into a center is just a tsunami. So you got to be aware of the situation your reviewer is in, and you may want something now or a response more quickly, but you just kind of have to be patient, express concern or a desire for something, but always that respectful tone. I think the other key is just being flexible. You can't come into the FDA and say, I have this vision that this communication is going to produce this result and only this result. If you have that kind of idea, you're just going to run into a wall, and you're going to be not only frustrated, but potentially angry with the FDA for not giving you what you thought that conversation should generate, or that pre-submission or whatever it is. So be flexible to say, okay, I really would like X to come out of the conversation, but if Y or Z comes out, I'll be just as satisfied. And kind of having that triage to say, there are some secondary goals that I can live with and can work with in that conversation will kind of help foster that respect and that smooth conversation.
Thank you, Mark. Mc?
Yeah, just real quick, build on those themes, right? Trust, build trust. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've worked across 5 branches. And much like Karen said, I re-encounter many of these FDA reviewers and leaders. So it's not so much the name of the company on the letterhead as much as who's signing the letter, right? Because I've worked across these platforms. So, and be ready. I kind of joke with my team that I'm a nice, easygoing guy, right? And team player. Mm-hmm. But when a question comes in from FDA or regulator, I go into sequester mode. So you, Mr. Engineer, the only reason you're here and the only reason you're getting paid on Friday is to answer this question. Mm-hmm. If you have any misunderstanding about that, let's talk to your manager. So, well, maybe a little help, and I'm being dramatic, right? But the point is, to Mark's comment, is be responsive, right? Because these FDA reviewers are really busy. They got 3 questions. You get back same day or next day, right? Obviously, with clarity, you're not going to conduct biocompatibility testing, but just be truthful, build that credibility, and be responsive. And I'll close on this. When you write the submission, think like a reviewer. It's hard to define that, but just think, be respectful of what is their question. If you have to, seek understanding and clarity, because if they're just saying, oh, please explain your biocompatibility program. Well, there's 19 parts or 18 parts to 10993. Can you be more specific, right? So again, that trust and back and forth will really help move the process forward.
Thank you, Mac. Oh, I think it's time. We have a little bit of time left. Let's go to the questions from the audience. Let's see. Jeff Bennett has a question. He said, we obtained IRB study approval, which included the risk assessment of the study device being non-significant risk. The FDA sent us communication asking for more information so they could make their own determination. How common is it to have FDA not agree with NSR designation from an IRB? Karen, would you like to start with that?
Yeah. So one of the follow-ons I had for Jeff was what was submitted to FDA, and if it was an IND that they were asking for more information on, or if it was or if it was a pre-sub. But oftentimes companies submit to the bodies in parallel. And FDA typically, unless you did a formal submission for their designation, FDA typically wants you to go to the IRB and to use them as FDA is kind of a fallback, because there's plenty of guidance on what IRBs are responsible for doing. So I'm unclear on what the nature of the FDA submission was that they're asking for additional information about. But in my experience, the I don't see a lot of times when FDA doesn't agree with the IRB because they really want the IRB to be making that determination. And you really only go to FDA if you're worried that the IRB is going to want you to go to FDA.
And maybe it's an ethics committee in Europe, right? And I mean, not that the practice of medicine is wildly different in Europe, but FDA has a certain understanding of the practice of medicine in the United States. And not that they're introducing bias to it, but again, they might have information that elevates the risk of this particular label and indication, right? So you may have to back off your indication a little bit. Who knows?
Yeah.
Mark, do you have something to add?
I have seen it happen where there's disagreement between the IRB and FDA. It's not, like Karen said, very common. I think it's also about choosing when to go to the FDA. And if you make that, start by making that internal determination, using the criteria, is a significant risk or not significant risk. If it's a really close call and you're really unsure, then maybe beneficial to go to the FDA first or to do it in tandem. But I think in most cases, you can really rely on the IRB to make that determination and for FDA to agree with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
We maybe just honorable mention here. We anticipated, and I think I might have saw some least burdensome comments out there, but we talked about the role of the Ombudsman, and I'll be the lawyer here, even though Mark's the lawyer. Although I use this a lot as regulatory professional, it depends. when you go to the Ombudsman, we're not going to have time to explore that here, but there's that's out there. Again, if you built credibility, trust, and transparency, and somehow you get stuck, and because there actually are protocols, so to speak, practices to escalate within a branch or within OPEC, right? Because nobody wants to. Not that going to the Ombudsman's a negative. It's just also another. I like to call it a lifeline. When I've used it, I just kind of like phone a friend, use a lifeline, and then we get stuck, and then that allows us to take the next step forward.
Let's take one more question. This is a question regarding. Sorry, Mac. I don't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
It's regarding guidance documents. So the companies, somebody has a question regarding guidance documents. The company this person worked for, they just received their DEA schedule. So it's one bulk manufacturing license for cannabis. So they are one of the only 5 licenses they were given out about a month ago. So their main goal is to manufacture cannabis at the federal level and become an API manufacturer. So what this person want to know is how can they combine the use of guidance document, botanical drug development guidance, with the use of CFR 210 and 211. So they have met with the agency. However, this is a very new area of interest as far as cannabis as a drug. And, they couldn't give much information. So, this person want to know, like, any suggestions from you guys?
So part 210 and part 211 are the good manufacturing practices for drugs. That's obviously going to speak to the quality standards that the API has been made to. The difficulty in bulk producing for other companies to use in their products is a lot of what's driven both in CDRH and CDER is indications for use specific. So you come through and say, I want to develop a drug for epilepsy like Epidiolex did. And then the FDA will work with you to say, okay, what evidence do we need to establish safety and efficacy for that indication? When you don't have an indication, you're just trying to do bulk. The best approach is probably to do a drug master file for FDA. And I think if you find the channel that you're trying to work through, like a DMF or a specific indication for use, then I think that the FDA can look at that. And I know there's a difference between synthetic and plant-derived cannabis, and so that may be another discussion for FDA to have in the pre-submission, which are available in the CDER side as well. I think every center has a pre-submission mechanism. It's a pre-IND for the drug side, and I think maybe going to the FDA and saying you're pursuing a DMF may help clarify what kind of questions you have and what kind of data or other things you're going to need to produce for FDA.
Thank you, Mark. Anybody else? Oh, we're a minute over. Well, I think I think we're a minute over, so I think I'm just told to wrap up. So thank you, everybody. Anything else you would like to add? Anybody else?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Indeed,
Well,
thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, everybody, for this is a very interesting and very intriguing and very informative discussion. Thank you, everybody, for your time. And thank you. And thank you for joining us for all the audience that participated. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.